ahead and get started, everybody. That clock's a little wrong anyway. Thank you all for coming. And just before we get started, I think it's going to be pretty exciting. I just want to say to everyone, tomorrow is a 501c3 nonprofit working every day to improve the quality of life for all the people of the Houston region. And we need your help to continue doing this. We're just starting our annual campaign. And so through the end of the year, every dollar donated is going to be matched by the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation to support our work on sustainability. So please go to HoustonTomorrow.org and do what you can. And also we'll be soon, we're going to do a campaign and we'll have new bumper stickers coming soon. And we're very excited. So today we have Christof Spieler. Christof has been involved in Houston transportation thing for a long time. He is now a Metro board member and works for Morris Architects. But he's been with the Citizens Transportation Coalition for a long time. He was writing the blog Intermodality, where we all learned how to talk about transit and things. And so now he has been spearheading an effort by Metro to reimagine the system and to think about what we really do. And so in this, they just got the RFQs back. So this process is just kind of beginning. So I'll give you Christof to tell us all about it.
Okay, yeah, it is sort of funny because I'm talking about the project in the midst of the consultant selection process with some of the consultants in the room. But I am not giving any secrets here, and I myself am not on the evaluation committee. So, so there's no insider information to be had here. So I want to talk about system reimagining, but I want to start by talking a little bit about what has worked when it comes to transit in Houston. We can prove very clearly that if you provide good transit, people in Houston will ride it. We have one of the best park and ride commuter systems in the country. I'd stack this up happily against most commuter rail systems, and this is actually a better system. Serves all of the major freeway corridors. Buses leave the major park and ride lots as often as every 5 minutes. They get directly onto barrier-separated HOV lanes out of freeway traffic. They run nonstop to downtown, exit directly onto downtown streets, and stop within a couple of blocks of essentially every major downtown employer. This system has amazing modal share. For the people who live in the areas served by the park and rides and who work downtown, about half of them ride the bus. So why is that? It's because this service is frequent. It's because this service is fast. It's faster than driving, actually. It's very reliable. It will be there for you. It will get you where you want to go when you want to get there. It's an easy to understand system. You have park and ride lots. You have downtown. They are connected. It's got high quality stops. It's both on the downtown end where we have good sidewalk infrastructure and good shelters, but also on the other end where the park and ride lots are a good place to catch a bus. And it connects to a major employment center. We've also had a major success with light rail here in Houston. Our little 7.5-mile line opened in 2003. It links into the bus system. About half the riders on the rail line are actually local bus riders transferring to rail. They are getting a faster and more reliable trip as a result of the rail system than they were before. Serves the Texas Medical Center, which is as big as most downtowns in the United States. Serves educational institutions like Rice. Serves Herman Park. Serves the Museum District. Serves places like Midtown, where we've seen quite a bit of development in the wake of the rail line. And of course downtown, the biggest employment center in the region. 7.5 miles, and on a map, it looks a little puny, and we can look at Dallas and get a little bit of envy, but we shouldn't get too much envy, because it turns out we're actually doing things incredibly well. This is the Houston versus Dallas comparison. They have 10 times as much rail as we do. They spent 10 times as much money to build it, and they're basically getting just barely twice the ridership we are. 10 times as much track to carry 2 times as many people. And that's because we built the right rail line in the right place. And that rail line has been drawing people who were not riding the bus before as well. And why has it done that? Because it's frequent, and frequent all day. I can show up at the station without a timetable any time of day and I know my train is coming. It's fast. Not only is it faster than the buses that ran before, but if you actually figure out the trip time from downtown to the medical center, rail's faster than driving. It's very reliable, always gets me there on time. I know exactly when I have to leave the door to get to a Metro Board meeting, and I will make it on time, as that train will not be delayed. Incredibly easy to understand, high quality station amenities, connects to major employment centers, and it serves a lot of different kinds of trips. It's not just home to work, it's all the other kind of trips we take. So those are the success stories. But we really need to look at the rest of our system and how do we improve the rest of our system. So a couple of things we're doing already. We are improving the reliability of the system that we have. We have a lot of new buses on the street. Here you see some of our new hybrid park and ride buses, for example. We're going to an all-hybrid fleet. We're buying 100 buses a year. So that works for a 1,200 bus fleet with a 12-year average age. We're keeping that fleet in a state of good repair. And the new buses are much better than the ones they're replacing. We're getting ready to actually add natural gas to that mix. Here's the first natural gas buses we operate are actually downtown, the Green Link, so they're not even our buses. But we're going to start adding natural bus gases to the Metro fleet starting shortly. And the behind-the-scenes story of all of this is the system has gotten a great deal more reliable. This is a transit walk number. Mean distances between failure. How much, on average, does a bus run before it breaks down? And just like when your car breaks down, when the bus breaks down, it's a very bad thing because we have some riders stranded. So the less often this happens, the better. And because of new buses, because of greatly improved maintenance procedures, because of a really incredible staff, we're basically doubled the mean distance between failure in our fleet since 2004. What this means is a lot more people are having reliable trips. We've also really worked on improving how you can access our system. Every transit trip either starts or ends or both is a bike ped trip. There's essentially no transit rider who has a car waiting for them on both ends of the trip. And the transit riders who park and ride are actually a minority of our riders. So how do we make these connections better? How do we get you so that you can get from your bus or from your train to the final destination? One of our big initiatives there is with Bikes on Buses, which we're getting about 10,000 boardings a month now. And one of our new initiatives here is actually looking at improving connections between the transit system and our bike network. So the Bayou Greenways initiative that passed back in November, if you look at where those bayous are, if you look at where our transit system are, there's some really natural connection points. And if we can improve those connection points, places like TMC Transit Center, those bike trails will be feeders to our system. And the nice thing about people who come on bikes, it's a whole lot cheaper to provide a bike rack than it is to provide a parking space. Bike and ride is a lot more cost effective than park and ride. So the more people we give that opportunity, the better we are. We've also been rolling out a system of getting a program of getting new shelters on the system. Every new shelter we put in adds up to about 20 more boardings on our bus system. So the more of these shelters we get out there, the more people ride, and the more of our existing riders get a better trip. We're also doing some things to operate the service we operate more cost effectively. And this is incredibly important because the more cost effective you are, the more service you can provide. And here's one of those tools. This is one of our new ARBOC buses we just ordered. This allows us to run some bus routes with smaller vehicles. But the key here is not just smaller vehicles, it's that these don't take the same level of driving skills that a full-size bus does. So we also negotiated with the union to get a service driver position so that we can operate these as a lower labor rate. This allows us to put service on routes at lower cost for low ridership routes, and lets us spend that money we save improving service elsewhere. So we're doing some good things, but fundamentally we are faced with what I would call a crisis. We are losing ridership. Here is our ridership since 2002 system-wide. This blue graph shows average weekday boardings. What you'll notice is we were actually rising through 06, 07, plateaued out when the recession had started dropping, and we're barely beginning to recover. The economy has recovered, but our ridership hasn't. And why is this? And the first thing everybody will say is we canceled all the routes. And what this graph shows is that's not what's going on. This orange line is how much service we provide. And you will notice, I joined the board 3 years ago, so this is before then. But what you will notice is right here, there were some low-performing routes cut. Less bus service on the street. Ridership rose. This ridership drop has been in a context of a steady amount of service. So the loss in ridership is not about how much service we put on the street. Something else we know about our ridership. This is people who work downtown, who work downtown, and how many of them use transit based on how far away from downtown they live. Once you're outside Beltway 8, you're getting to that 50% share I was talking about. Look at the share in the inside 610, inside Beltway 8. We've got a big hole right here of a lot of people who live close to downtown who are not taking the bus. There's a market here that we're missing. And those streets that they're taking are getting more and more congested. Anybody who drives Washington Avenue or Kirby or Shepherd, you know what's happening to the traffic. But we're not drawing those riders. And we also know something else about who's riding our system. This is the different services that we offer and the mix of household incomes on those services. So Metro Local, Metro Rail, Park and Ride, Metro Lift, and the overall service area. That cutoff point there is roughly median income. So let's look at what that means. Metro service area, roughly half of households are below that median income level. You look at Metro Rail's ridership profile is actually pretty close to what the service area as a whole is. Who's riding the train is a cross-section of who lives here. But then we can go to the other extremes. Park and Ride, incredibly affluent clientele. Only about 17% as opposed to 50% below that median income level. Local, 84% below median. And Metro Lift, 97%. What this tells me, when I look at the local bus system, is that most of our riders are people who are riding because they don't have another choice. And that's a really bad sign. It is obviously one of the main purposes of transit to be a social safety net, to give an alternative where there are no other alternatives. But this kind of profile is the sign of a system that is sick, that is not working. Every good transit system draws people from multiple income levels. And the reason it does that is if a transit system provides good enough service, everybody will want to ride it. And if it provides good enough service, that benefits everybody. Otherwise, what you have is low quality transit for people who don't have a choice. And I don't think anybody should aim for that. So clearly something is wrong here, and we want to move these numbers. So why have we lost ridership? First, and you can actually see this in that graph, is our fare system. And this is not simply about base fare. Base fare did get raised from $1 to $1.25 a couple years ago, but it's the lowest, it's one of the lowest base fares in the country. It's not an expensive base fare. But something else happened when the Q card got implemented, and I love my Q card, it's a really easy way to ride. But what we did is we greatly simplified the fare system. Once again, this was previous administration. To basically two choices. You can pay with cash or you can pay with a smart card that deducts per ride. Other cities have day passes, they have weekly passes, they have monthly passes, they have visitor passes, some have ride-free zones, some have discounted passes for off-peak travel. We don't have any of that. And the funny thing about this smart card is it actually makes all of these systems much easier. A monthly pass on a smart card works incredibly easily. The bus driver doesn't even have to pay attention. The light turns green and it means your monthly pass is valid. So this is one of the things we're actually looking at, bringing back the day pass, starting to bring out more different kinds of fares, because this is predictability. It's predictability and it's freedom. It means that you know how much you're going to spend every day to travel, and it also means that each additional trip is free. So it encourages you to make more of your trips over the course of the day using transit. So fares are one reason I think we've lost ridership. Another is that if you look across the region, the number of people who are dependent on transit is actually going down. So that core of our local bus ridership, people who don't have a choice, there's fewer of them. The other thing is this region is transforming dramatically. This is the Washington Avenue corridor. Every building you see in red is less than 20 years old. We are seeing the wholesale redevelopment of large parts of our city. The good news is those areas are getting a lot denser, just by the free market. And that's a very good thing for transit. But they're also getting more affluent in the process. And the people who are moving in are much less likely to use transit than the people who lived there before. And meanwhile, the people who lived there before have moved elsewhere, and those other neighborhoods may not have the transit service. We're also seeing population growing outside of the areas we're currently covering. Here's population density in our route structure. There's new pockets of population density that are outside of the areas currently covered by our routes. And if you look at that black line, some of those pockets are actually happening outside of the metro service area. And I drew this map before the Pasadena bus service got discontinued by Harris County. So we take away the Harris County bus service, this looks even worse. We also have multi-centric employment. And where you work has a lot to do with whether you take transit. Downtown, 40% transit use. Medical center, 30%. Greenway Plaza, 5%. The two major employment centers that are served with high-quality transit, high modal share, everything else is low. I think we should probably wait questions till the end. And this is a difficult problem to solve. The urban form of much of the city is not very transit friendly. This is actually where I used to work when I rode the number 9 bus. Here's where I got off every morning. And I got off along with a couple of middle school students. We would have to cross 5 lanes of West Park without a crosswalk or a traffic signal. And nobody actually follows Texas law and yields to you if you're standing in the middle of the street. Walk down the street without a sidewalk. At that point, I'm getting to my building, but the students would then continue on, walk through a gap in the hedge right here, walk through here behind the Home Depot loading docks, walk across the HCC parking lot, and get to school. We do not have a very comfortable or safe environment for a lot of our riders. And why do they have to walk that way? Because both HCC and HISD built their schools on a one-way frontage road. So we can run a bus one way, but we can't run it back. Another challenge with our system, much of what we're operating is very low frequency service. This is line thickness of our local system by frequency of service. Those thin lines are cases where the buses run every half hour, every 45 minutes, every hour. This is the kind of service where you have to plan your life around the bus. And a lot of the structure of this system is incredibly confusing. This is very typical of our route structure. A lot of routes that don't follow particularly logical paths, that turn places you wouldn't necessarily expect them to, that branch apart. We have the number 50 in here, which a couple of trips in the afternoon rush hour skips about half of its route and runs direct on the freeway. If you don't know that, and you get on the number 50 thinking you're going to the Heights, you get this sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach when it suddenly gets on the freeway and speeds up and passes your stop right by. This is the kind of system that works very well if you ride the same bus at the same time every day, but it's a very difficult system to understand if you're making different trips every day at different times. And ultimately, I would argue that's one of our biggest problems. We don't have a very legible system. If you're not used to riding the system, it is very difficult to understand it. And that, again, is the opposite of the rail line. The rail line, incredibly simple to understand. Our bus system is incredibly complicated. And we have some challenges here. We don't have enough money. This is what happened to our sales tax in the 2008 recession. It dropped. Our projections don't show that recovery. The gap between here and here is the university line. This gap is the rail we are not building right now. Here's a look ahead of our financials. And I'm sorry if this is too detailed, but just to show you where we're spending our money. This bottom chunk, local bus operations, park and ride, metro lift, metro van, and rail. The biggest chunk of our budget year in, year out is operating that local bus service. Railing is actually the cheapest of our services to operate for the number of people we carry. Next comes local bus, then comes park and ride, and then by far the most expensive is metro lift. This red chunk is committed capital projects. These are things that we are already in the process of building, primarily 3 rail lines and a couple of park and ride lots. You can see that big chunk here as the rail construction gets finished. Then right here is state of good repair, which is keeping our system in shape. It's new buses. It's making sure the roof on the bus garage doesn't leak. Here's our debt. We're actually carrying a very reasonable debt load. The number of sales tax bonds we've issued, very low compared to other systems. This is a very sustainable debt load. There's a hiccup in here, though, which is the previous regime issued a bunch of short-term commercial paper. We've got about 200 million of it sitting on our books, and we need to get that paid off. Right now, the interest rates are good, and it's not costing us much to keep that out there, but that's not going to continue, so we need to get that off of our books. On the top here is general mobility, and what this referendum just did is this yellow chunk here has been freed up. So that's additional money we weren't counting on before. This yellow plus this white is the money we have to expand the system. And when I say expand, that's capital projects and that's operating. And if you look at the cost of our bus service, this doesn't buy you a lot more bus service. We do have a big opportunity coming up though, which is we've got 3 new rail lines well past the 50% construction mark. We've passed the 50% mark on the amount of rail in the ground. And this will be up and operating in 2014. This gives us a real opportunity to rethink how our service works in those parts of town. And so that leads us into system reimagining. What we're saying here is, we know our system isn't the system it needs to be. We know our local bus system in particular isn't working as well as it ought to. And we know we have an opportunity coming up with the new rail lines to rethink how that works. So what we're going to do over the course of the next year is fundamentally reimagine our bus system. And so here's what we're going to do to get there. Step 1 of the project, we have to define what our goals are. And this sounds like a really basic statement, but right now we do not have any agency policy as to what our goals are. And the problem here is there's a lot of very good goals. There's a lot of things we can all agree on. The problem is that a lot of those good things are actually in conflict with each other. Here's one of the basic ones. Ridership or coverage. If you run a transit system, you can maximize it for ridership, or you can maximize it for how much area you serve. If you maximize how much area you serve, you're actually minimizing your ridership. And the way to maximize ridership is to serve less area. So if ridership was our only goal, we'd discontinue 3/4 of our bus routes, greatly increase service on the remaining quarter, and we would have more people riding the bus. If coverage was our only goal, we'd run buses down Westheimer every 45 minutes and add service to incredibly low density areas at the outer edge of our service area. How do you strike that balance? What is actually our goal? And then if you set that goal, how do you actually measure that? Because what you measure dictates what you do. So in this step, we'll do 2 things. The first is, We'll set out what these goals are. We'll actually have a board approval of a resolution that says this is what we're planning for. And secondly, we're going to set out the measures we're going to use to see if we're achieving those goals. Second step, we have to define our tools. What kind of service will we provide to meet those goals? So one question is, what kind of vehicle do we use? Previous administration said, essentially, we have two tools in the toolbox. We have a 40-foot local bus, we have a 45-foot commuter bus. And every scheduled bus route we have will get one or the other. I think there's probably some gaps in that lineup. I think that there's probably a smaller vehicle, which we've already bought some of, which fills in those routes where the 40-foot bus is too big. And on those routes where these guys are running standing room only, maybe we want to throw in a bigger articulated bus. And actually, we've ordered those as well. So we're already moving towards a system where we have more choices of vehicles to better serve the requirements on different routes. To serve the really low ridership in Manchester on one end, serve the really high ridership in Westheimer on the other, serve the local routes, serve the park and ride routes. And it may be that in this process we figure out there's a couple more tools we need, or that we need a different mix of these buses in the fleet. The other thing we need to decide is what kind of services do we provide? Here's what we're providing right now in terms of scheduled route service. We have Park and Ride, which we call Park and Ride. It's funny how it really doesn't have an official brand. Metro Rail. Then we have Swift Line and Quick Line. We have exactly one Swift Line route and one Quick Line route. So I keep joking that next we'll add Expeditious Line or Fast Line. Or there's already, here's two branded routes that are already setting up some confusion as to what they mean. It turns out the Quick Line has a blue line painted down the street and the Swift Line doesn't, among other things. A lot of the distinctions between these have very little to do with what service you actually get.
Oh, is that right? So Swift Line is not faster?
I'm not sure which is faster, but they're essentially, the funny thing is the two routes actually meet each other in the TNC. And then we have our local service, which is actually not branded at all. If you look at the history of Metro, the decision was made that the overriding goal of Metro in terms of visuals was to have a uniform corporate identity, which is why these two buses look the same, even though they provide very different kinds of service. And the question is, do we want to actually think about branding? If you go to LA, you'll see that they have buses which are red and say rapid, and which are orange and say local, that they actually have visual distinctions between the kind of service they provide. We aren't doing that. And the local system in particular is sort of treated as the generic service. The other thing we're doing here is we're lumping all the local routes together. A route which runs every 15 minutes and a route which runs every hour are completely different kinds of service. The way you can use them to get around the city are just a universe of difference. One is I walk out the door and I know a bus will be coming. The other is I have to plan my whole schedule around it. We're calling them the same thing. The buses look the same, the bus stops look the same. There's no distinction whatsoever. And then step three. Step three is rethink the route structure. And what we're saying here is rethink it from a blank sheet of paper. Look at the demographics of this region. Look at where people live. Look at where people work. Look at the capital investments we have in place. Look at the transit centers we have in place. Look at where the rail lines are, obviously. Look at the HOV links. Those are givens. But beyond that, start with a blank sheet of paper. Don't tweak the buses we have now. Actually say, if I was doing a bus system from scratch for this region, what would it look like? And a lot of the bus routes we have actually have very long histories. We have bus routes that can trace their descent from streetcar lines. So they've been running in essentially the same place for 100 years. These bus routes have not changed as the city has changed around them. They've been tweaked, but they've never been fundamentally altered. So we have bus routes running in places where we probably don't need them anymore, where there's other routes that are better routes that are nearby. In the past, all we've ever really done is tweak routes. We've looked at the lowest ridership routes and said, what do we do about these? And unfortunately, the goal through many of those discussions was, how can we save the most money while losing the least ridership? And I think that's a really dumb question to ask. Because as soon as losing ridership is part of your going-in assumption, you're doing something wrong. Fundamentally, you can't understand a system by thinking of it as 100 different routes. The only way to understand a system is to actually think of it as a system. So what we're saying is analyze this as a system. And the question here is, how can we improve local bus? How can we make local bus a more effective system? And let's think back to some of the things we were saying about the rail lines. Frequent. To me, this is one of the best things we can do. Frequent service is frequent. Fast. How can we make routes more direct? How can we make things faster? We're never going to get to HOV or rail speed without putting a bus in its own lane, but we can definitely look at making travel times better. Reliable, same thing. What can we do to make routes more reliable? Sometimes that may mean shorter routes, for example, that are less likely to get caught by a freight train 10 miles before they got to you. How do we make the system easier to understand? How do we add station amenities? How do we connect to employment centers? And all of them. You know, right now we've got a really great system for going downtown, but if you're trying to figure out a trip to Greenway, it's remarkable how difficult that can be. One of my examples here is the Westheimer bus. Westheimer bus goes down Westheimer, makes it to Smith, Louisiana, and then turns downtown. If I want to go from Westheimer to the Texas Medical Center, my first transfer point between the Westheimer bus and light rail is at Main Street Square. So I've just detoured all the way up to downtown to catch a train which takes me back. So we have a system that works well for downtown, but not as much the other employment centers. And finally, serves many kinds of trips. We want a system that people won't just use to go to work. We want a system that people will use to go shopping. We want a system that people will use on the weekends. Fundamentally, a good transit system is one that serves all of the trips you make. And the reality is only about a quarter of the trips we make are on-to-work trips. So we need to accommodate those other trips. And if you look across the country, there are cities that have done very good things in this regard. Portland has a frequent service system. This is their frequent service map. These are the routes that run often. You get to the stop and they're branded. It says this is a frequent route. Toronto went to a grid. It's a wonderfully easy system to navigate. Every major arterial has a bus line on it. Nearly every one of those lines connects to a subway station. You don't need a map to understand the system. You just go to a busy street and you find a bus stop and you know you have found a bus that runs up and down that street. So there's a lot of tools we have, a lot of ways we could change the system that will serve our existing riders better and bring new people into the system. But the key to making this work is public involvement. And I think this is something that in the past we've done very badly. Here's how Metro has done public involvement on service changes. We post this notice. It was amusing. When I first got on board, we realized that the notice for the public hearing to change bus routes and the notice that the bus routes were being changed was the same piece of paper. The going-in assumption was the public meeting would not change anything. We've changed that. Since we've been on the board, the public meetings have actually meant something. But step number one, you announce the changes. Step number two, everybody gets upset at you. And this is inevitable. Anytime you change something, the people who are affected by the change negatively are going to show up. And the people who benefit will not. And the media will always report on the people who are negatively affected and never on the ones who are positively affected. It's inevitable. And so step number two, everybody gets upset. And step number three is we form partnerships to try to deal with this. So here's a bus, number 59, for example, that we actually did a funding partnership with a local management district and were able to bring that service back. So that's always been the step. Number one, plan what you're going to do. Number two, tell the public and the public gets upset. And number three, then you try to deal with it. What we're going to do now is we're going to start with the last step. We're going to start by bringing in the public and the major stakeholders and the management districts and the cities and the employers. We're going to start by bringing them into the process and actually work through this process with the people who ride our system, with the people who need our system. So that rather than us thinking that the people who best understand the system are people who are sitting in an office in 1600 Main, we're actually saying that people who best understand our system are the ones who are out there in the city. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to set up a very robust public input process with major stakeholders, with the public as a whole, every step through this process, so that by the time we end up at the final result, people will understand how we get there, and they'll have had input on every step. So here's what we're actually doing. The Strategic Planning Committee, which I am chair of, was formed in September 2012. This is explicitly a committee whose job is the long-term strategic planning. We don't have agenda items in every committee meeting for buying motor oil. We're not distracted by all the day-to-day stuff that has to happen to run an agency. We're looking forward. We issued a request for qualifications for consultants in October. We are in the midst of that selection process. By January, we hope to have a consultant selected. In spring, we'll look at the first deliverables. By late 2013, we should have a completed project, or early 2014, and then new rail lines will go into service in 2014. So you can see this is this is not long-range planning, this is short-range planning. This is what can we do now that will make a difference in the next 5 years. And what we've explicitly asked for is this is about being flexible with resources. I showed you a graph about financials. I do not have a crystal ball. I actually have no idea exactly how much sales tax we're going to get in 3 years. So when we design a system, we should design a system that can accommodate different levels of resources. And so we've actually asked for a system that costs 10% less to operate and a system that costs 10% more to operate. So that we actually have it built into the master plan, that flexibility to respond to what's out there. And the goal is to actually be implementing major system changes in 2014, so that by 2 years from now, we could have a bus system that looks fundamentally different than what you see on the street today. And the goal here, this is not a bus versus rail discussion. The goal here is a better transit system. The goal here is a system that links the park and ride service, that links the local bus service, that links the signature service, that links the rail line. This is actually what we have today. If you look at, these are our frequent routes today, and our park and rides and our signature bus. So there's the beginnings of that kind of system. How can we make that a more robust, more connected, easier to understand, more useful system? And that's what the goal here is. So I actually believe that what we're doing here is probably the most important thing we have underway right now. We're finishing the rail lines, that's important, but that's a construction project now. I think at the top of the list of the best things we can do in the near future is this process. And I think this actually builds to more future rail lines. I think the more successful the bus system is, the more rational it is, the better connections it has. That's what actually ends up supporting converting some of those routes to rail as the demand justifies. So that's what we're up to, and I'm happy to answer questions.
So the question I was going to ask earlier was that 30% transit share for the medical center.
Yes.
Do you have any idea how much of that is park and ride versus Smithland's parking shuttle up the rail?
I don't know the numbers on that. A chunk of that is obviously Smithland's. But there is a good deal of park and ride coming into the Med Center, both directly and via light rail connection. And I would say what Smithland's is doing is actually very similar to what Downtown Park and Ride is doing, in that it is taking traffic off of streets that can't handle it. Essentially, the people who are parking at Smithland's were instead driving into the medical center, Fannin would be a whole lot worse than it is. And the fact that the rail connection is there gives those people a chance to park further out and get to their jobs reliably in the way a shuttle bus would.
But it doesn't help with the freeways, obviously.
No, it doesn't help on the freeways because it's much shorter distance.
Is the park and ride part of your rethink?
Yes, absolutely.
Not just local. Okay.
Now, I will say I would expect that in terms of the route map, the park and ride won't change that much because the HOV lanes are where they are. We can't move them.
Are you?
Nor do we
part
want
of the
to.
thinking process is where should we add HOV lanes?
I think that could definitely, what we're doing, this is a capital constrained project. So overall, we're not looking for a lot of recommendations on things to build because we can't afford it. It doesn't matter if we have it as a recommendation. I definitely think this goal of connecting to more employment centers is key for the park and rides. And sometimes it's really easy answers. For example, we used to have a bus on Allen Parkway which existed primarily to connect people who worked at the American General Complex to park and ride routes downtown. And it had really low performance. So we got rid of that bus, and the internal recommendation was those people who ride the West Dallas bus, which they did, and they weren't happy with it. Except one of them had a really good idea that none of the Metro service planners had looked at, which is one of the park and ride buses to the medical center actually goes right by the American General Complex without stopping. And they asked, what if we put a bus stop here? And so we did that bus stop. And now rather than being a situation where those park and riders had one part of their trip made less convenient, their whole trip has gone from a two-bus trip to a one-bus trip. They actually have better service than they started with. And I'm sure there are more opportunities like that. And I think the more better integration between the park and ride system and the rest of the system is very useful. It can support higher levels of midday and evening park and ride service, which would be very useful. So park and ride is definitely a part of this.
As far as capital constraint, is it possible to even think about adding diamond lanes to things like 610 or Beltway 8?
We are working right now, and this is a whole different project, but we are working with Uptown District right now on making the Uptown line happen as a BRT service linking to park and rides on north and south ends. That will require adding an HOV lane in a section of 610 between Post Oak and I-10. And they are working with TxDOT right now on trying to figure out how to make that happen. The room is there, but TxDOT has to figure out, in terms of their design standards, how that works.
But there's no chance of them converting a 3-lane to diamond.
That's a political question. I can make a really good technical argument for doing that. Can I make a political argument for doing that? That's a whole different question.
Christof, how is the public input going to fit to that timeline?
It will be all through that timeline, and I can't tell you when meeting dates will be, and we're actually looking to the consultant to give us some ideas on how best
So
to
the
run this.
consultants are going to be involved in that? Or?
Oh, totally. Totally. Then you bring on consultants because they have an outside perspective, a fresh perspective on the system. And you bring them on because they've been part of doing this successfully in other cities.
Well, this is for me, it's very exciting.
Okay, so this last referendum, we now are not going to build that east-west metro rail line. There was going to be the key connector for the supercore of Houston. Is there some thought of having bus rapid transit or something that could really be almost the equivalent of rail for that, to make that connection and complete
So number one, I will not say that we're not going to build it, because we're going to try everything we can to get that line built. Number two, I think that is an important transit corridor regardless. And so having Greenway Plaza needs to be better connected. We know that. So one thing that can come out of this, for example, is it might be a plan to upgrade bus service on Richmond that could later be replaced by the rail line.
Right.
So, I mean, the implementation of this is definitely quicker than rail implementation. It takes 5 years to build a rail line. This will be implemented in 3.
And then it needs to be transferred to a rail line once
Exactly, and the more intelligent your system is, it actually makes it easier to do those kinds of things. And once again, that's not the goal here. The goal is to put a better system on the ground, but if you put a more logical system on the ground, it actually supports later implementation of higher capacity transit on some of those routes.
On the question of branding and success, the Quick Line, which was, I think, the Metro's busiest local line in terms of how successful has that been in some ways? Because I think I remember you told me once a couple of years ago that it's had a mixed record.
Okay, so here's the Quick Line in Bel Air. The Quick Line is a rush hour only limited stop service. It's like the Rapid in LA, which gets its speed by stopping less, except it runs only during rush hour. If you, last bus of the day is at 6. If you have to work till 6, you've missed the last bus and you're on the local. It has not, the numbers we've seen is that it has moved people from the local service to the Quick Line, which is a very good thing. I mean, it means there's people who have a 15-minute faster trip every day. So providing better service for the transit riders we had already is a laudable thing. But we do not have the evidence that it has attracted new riders to the system. And I suspect the operating hours are a big part of that problem. That it is not the kind of service that you feel like you can depend on all day.
So is there an idea to expand that, so maybe then you could use it?
That's part of it. That kind of quick line implementation, that's definitely something we can do within the resources we have. So I'm looking to this process to tell us, are there other corridors we want to do that? And there's been corridors like Westheimer, like Gessner, that have been out there for a long time as something that needs this. So I think it's quite likely that that's part of the outcome.
I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but a lot of people I know voted for Metro, thinking they were voting for rail because the way it was worded. Do you feel confident that it was an honest vote of the will of the people to do this?
As some of you may
You have
know,
to put it on the ballot, correct?
as some of you may know, I am the 1 in 8 to 1. But essentially, here's how I would put this. We have a referendum, it's been adopted. It gives us a clear parameter of what we're working within for the next decade. And now we know, and now we're going to move forward within those parameters. I don't think this vote can be re-argued. This was a vote of the people, and it was what it was. And it did give us more money to transit, which is a good thing. It gave us some certainty, and it avoided some political battles that we might not have won. Those are good things. But I think fundamentally the challenge is, how can we do the best transit system we can do within the resources we have? And that hasn't changed. That was the challenge beforehand, it's the challenge now.
And having that certainty now, that clarity.
We have some room to operate in here.
Christof, do you have concerns that during the consultation and open, transparent process that folks may not want to engage because they're afraid that at the end there may be some backroom deals that will change how things are set up?
Frankly, I don't think this is the kind of thing that will lead to a lot of backroom politics. I can tell you, this will go completely wrong if elected officials aren't part of the discussions from the beginning. It will go completely wrong if major parts of the population aren't included. But I think if we run this process well, it will actually lead to a result that everybody that makes sense. I think this can be a win-win. And I think in that way, it's very much different than general mobility, because general mobility was arguing over slices of the pie, and the pie was a given size. You know, on general mobility, there were going to be winners and there were going to be losers. I think this is the kind of thing where you can have a lot of winners.
On the, I think it's right that the project is constrained to current reality, but sort of following the Metro referendum and I think the general public consciousness of transportation funding and transit funding, and a lot of people thought they were getting more money for Metro. And in our region, the balance between road spending and transit is way off towards roads, and there's a lot of money that could be shifted towards transit in the next 5 years, especially things like CMAQ, SPDMM money. So could part of this process be, if we had 20% more money, here's what we would do, here's how your life would be better if we did?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately that this will point a pretty clear direction. You know, at the end of the day, in a resource-constrained process, you also find out what you can't afford. You will find that there were a lot of things on the table that were nice, that would have been desirable, that didn't make the final plan. And we will know what those things are. So I think you're absolutely right that one outcome of this may be that you find places where a capital project or where more operating hours would make a significant difference outside of the resources we have right now, and that might trigger a process of saying, how do we change that? But fundamentally, this is not a plan which is about major capital projects. We're actually doing a separate planning process for prioritizing our capital projects. To me, this is fundamentally about where we put our operating costs. And as I showed you, that's a huge chunk of our budget. And how do we use that part of the budget? And I also think that the more successful the bus system is, the more demand there is for rail. It will ultimately ultimately people want a complete system. They want all of these different pieces that go together here, so that, you know, if all of this works together better, the whole system works better. And I mean, I see examples of that every day. I get on the train at Preston Station, and every morning I'm standing there, and one park and ride bus after another pulls up on the street, and half a dozen people get out of that bus, 10 people get out of that bus, walk over to the rail station and get on the train. Those are people who are headed to places like the Med Center that don't have direct service from their park and ride lots, and they're using this as a connected system. Their daily commute is part train and part bus. And I really have a problem with anybody who sets transit up as a debate of bus versus rail, because I don't think that's what it is. Every good transit system in the world is a connected system. And ultimately what people care about is not actually what material connects their vehicle to the ground. It's what kind of service do we have. The reason the rail line is a good thing is not because it has tracks, it's because it's more reliable, it's faster, it's more convenient, it's easier to use. It's those factors that actually matter. And ultimately, our system will always be a connected multimodal system, and the better it works together as a system, the better it works for everyone.
We had a different question. One of the great good news of the selection was this tremendous support for the Bayou Greenway Initiative. 300 miles of bike trails, connected all around. So is there some serious thinking about how to make bicycles be one of the key modes and be able to take my bike onto a light rail system, onto a bus, and be able to accommodate it?
I have been on many bike rides with Michael Skelly and other members of the Parks Board looking at the exact details of how to do that. I mean, we've been, you know, riding paths to figure out how to connect the MKT trail to U of H downtown, all of those things. And if you look at this system, there are a lot of places where that Bayou Greenway system and our transit system meet in quite wonderful ways. That, you know, the MKT trail is a good example of a trail that connects the Heights and connects the First Ward right to where our light rail line is. And what that means is people in those neighborhoods who don't have light rail in their neighborhood now have a path that takes them there. That same trail can actually connect the county jail complex to the light rail station if we provide the right connection. I mean, that is actually a major, there's a lot of people coming to the county jail complex to work, to visit, whatever, you know, and sometimes what's amazing is how short these links are. The Braves Bayou Trail, which is one of the best bike trails in the region, gets within a block of our Texas Medical Center Transit Center, but the nearest connection is about 6 blocks long. So they're right next to each other, but there's no trail connecting them. And I think in the past, we have often missed those kind of connections, and now we're taking a much stronger look at them, and we actually have HGAC sponsored a bike and ride process going on, which is a study actually looking at some of those links and how to make them happen. So I think that stuff absolutely works together.
We'll be able to accommodate the bikes on metro buses and
well, every bus we've got, you can take bikes on. Park and ride lots, I think, are a major potential market here. Kingwood, for example, has had a good bike connection for ages. We've just recently built a bridge on the west side to connect our I-10 park and ride system to allow the trail system out there. The new trains we were ordered actually have bike racks, and we're looking to increase bike hours on the trains. Already outside of rush hour, it's already there. And I think the other thing we can do is do more bike lockers and more bike racks. The other thing we actually work well together with as it expands is the bike share system. As that's another great tool for, like I've thrown out the Rice Village as an example. You want to go from downtown to the Rice Village. Bike share would be a really good solution. If you could pick up a bike at Herman Park and ride it to the village and drop it off again, we just extended the reach of the rail line without laying any track.
Park and ride question that I have. I noticed this month that park and ride usage from 2002 to 2011 had dropped. Now there's a dramatic increase in the number of park and rides. Those are your more affluent riders. So it was about a 10 or 12% drop in park and ride ridership from 2002 through 2011. And I also noticed that the park and ride subsidies annual is about $74 million a year.
Yeah.
So we're subsidizing park and ride $74 million of, let's say, what's a $400 million operating budget.
Right, I showed you on my graph here.
So how do you account for the drop in park and ride ridership from 2009 through 2011 and the subsidy being $74 million?
Well, I mean, the subsidy is fundamentally a public policy question. And the park and ride system was put in place by a political judgment of the region that is worth subsidizing. I mean, I will point out that every travel mode we have out there is subsidized. That freeways, according to TxDOT, don't even cover half of their cost with the fuel taxes that are burned on that freeway. Fundamentally, transportation policy is about deciding how many subsidies to direct where. And the park and ride system does a lot of economic good for the region. It definitely does a lot to help with congestion. If you imagine what downtown freeways would look like if it weren't for those buses, there's a lot of benefit we're getting for that subsidy. But it is absolutely a higher subsidy than we're providing for either the rail service or the local bus service. Why has ridership dropped? I don't know the answer to that. I have some ideas. One of them has to do with where the population is. And you look at the Texas Medical Center, for example, the employment in the medical center, a lot of that employment growth has been on the periphery of the campus in places that our park and rides don't serve as well. So where employment is happening and where population is happening, places like Pearland and Sugarland, which aren't on our system, that's definitely an effect. I think the other thing that happens is, if you dramatically widen a freeway so that the travel times on that freeway get a lot better, you're probably going to lose some transit ridership. So on a corridor like I-10, where what happened is we spent $2.8 billion to widen the freeway, and in the process did nothing to improve the transit service, didn't even add any new direct connectors to any new park and ride lots. That's going to change the modal share in that corridor. That is a massive government investment with the express goal of lowering transit ridership in that corridor. And so I think some of the park and ride drop we've seen probably has to do with those kind of projects.
That's only temporary.
And I mean, it's getting more congested again, so we'll see. But my take would be, if we're going to build a new freeway in this region, the goal should be that it should actually make transit service better and not worse. And we're fighting that fight on 290 right now. We're fighting that fight on I-45 right now. TxDOT's baseline design on 290 was to actually remove a park and ride lot. And what we're and turn a two-way HOV ramp to the Northwest Transit Center into a one-way ramp. And we're currently working with TxDOT and HECTRA to try to come up with a design there that actually does things like add a direct connect at Cypress Park and Ride, so that which is one of our more popular park and ride lots, has a more reliable connector to the new managed lanes. But, you know, that's a case where we've got to make sure that transit is included.
You haven't mentioned the revenue stream from the HOV lanes where you've opened them up a little bit more. And of course on I-10, that I'm curious, I mean, is that bringing in a steady revenue?
Well, okay.
The others are fairly new, but I-10 has been in place longer.
I think, I don't know, I'm not HECTRA. I-10 is run by the Toll Road Authority. And so I don't know what their revenue looks like compared to their projections. I know it's nowhere near as successful as something like that.
What about the HOV lane? Because they're both side by side on I-10, so you don't have stats on the usage. Or
we are not operating the lane in I-10.
So
we have rights to run our buses through them, but both as a carpool lane, as a toll lane, and as a transit facility, it's being operated by the Toll Road Authority, not by Metro. So they would have stats on how many HOVs are using that lane. In terms of us converting the rest of our HOV lanes into HOT lanes, it's a really interesting project. But there are limits on what it can do. And the biggest limit is that our HOV lanes were already maxed out at peak. That at the busiest hours of the morning and the afternoon, we were already running those maxed out. So we can't actually add any SOVs, single occupant vehicles, during that period. And therefore, you look at our HOT lanes, the operating hours are actually on the flanks of rush hour and not in the middle. So That's just a matter of real estate. Those lanes are carrying as much as several freeway lanes during the peak in terms of people through there. And so we don't get a lot of revenue. The HOT conversions, there's some revenue we get from that. That revenue is looks like it's just enough to offset the operating costs. So we're not getting a new revenue stream. What we're doing is we're giving people a new transit opportunity, and we've been able to automate a lot of the operations. And that automation, we should be able to offer some benefits. It should allow us to open the lanes longer, to open the lanes on days where they're not open right now. So things like, should the HOV lane coming in from San Antonio be open on the day after Thanksgiving, so people coming back from Thanksgiving dinner out of town can actually get a better trip? Those are the kind of things we can begin to do because of that automated operation.
Speaking of adding capacities of the park and rides, have you looked at the megabus buses? I rode one recently, the 2 stories.
Yes.
Does that add substantial capacity? Would that be something you guys would consider when you talk about adding to the bus?
I think we would definitely consider that. And we've even looked at, there's been an internal look at double-deckers on the Westheimer route, and it turns out the clearances, there are too many trees in there. But I think something like that is definitely a possibility. The trade-off with larger buses is pretty simple. A larger bus is lower operating cost because one driver drives more people. However, to provide the same capacity, it's a lower frequency. So that, for example, you might be running a double-deck bus every 15 minutes instead of a regular bus every 10. So that larger vehicles, to really make use of the larger vehicles, you often end up with something that actually makes the service a little less convenient. On a really heavily used service, nobody's going to care if I go from running every 5 minutes to running every 6. So, but the point on the park and rides would be there are some which are heavily used enough during the peak that those double-deckers would be a big improvement. But on the others, our loads, especially off-peak, are probably such that they wouldn't justify larger buses. And then the question becomes, does a small subset of buses make sense? But I think that's absolutely a really good thing to look at here. Everything we can do to improve the park and rides, I'm in favor of.
On the different sizes of buses, I heard some discussion back and forth on if Metro does get smaller buses, could they save money in terms of the bus drivers wouldn't have to get necessarily the same rigorous level of licensing, and then the payment scale would be different and things like that?
We have a lower pay scale for drivers operating smaller vehicles, and that's actually a result of the most recent union negotiations. Metro used to operate 30-foot buses in addition to, we still have a handful of 30-footers. The 30-footers were basically useless. A 30-foot bus, it turns out, the cost of the bus driver was exactly the same as a 40-foot bus. The cost of maintenance was exactly the same, and you saved a tiny little bit of gas. And so the goal with us putting in smaller buses is actually smaller buses which cost less to operate, and that's labor cost, that's gas, and that's smaller, lower maintenance vehicles because they're smaller enough that they use essentially truck engines instead of bus engines, etc. So it really is about trying to reduce your cost per revenue hour.
So it is possible to save money with smaller buses?
Yes.
Now?
Yes, but he took that labor agreement. Without the labor agreement, it didn't help.
Yeah, I've got a fair policy question. Under the old regime, y'all had nothing to do with it. In 2006, when they had the public meeting, what is the percentage of Q card users today? Is it 75%?
Somewhere around there.
Okay. In 2006, when they were starting to talk about the Q card, in the public meeting, they told the transit folks that there would be no change in the policy for cash. So in the public meeting in 2006, they said there's going to be no changes for cash. You can still use your cash. When they finally introduced the service, they changed that dramatically. And that changed the revenue stream in 2008 and 2009. So the people that pay cash, the other 25%, what I call the transit poor, people that can't afford to load $5 or $10 on a Q card that really are day-to-day, they ended up having to pay $6 or $7 million of the $13 or $14 million increase in fare revenues between 2008 and 2009. And of course, at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, they stripped away all the day passes. Now y'all are talking about bringing the day passes back. In terms of the fare policy for these new day passes, are you favoring 3 times, in other words, a $3.50, $3.75 rate? So that I'm worried about the transit poor.
Well, and I think your point, I disagree with the idea that the fundamental problem with people not using Q cards is they don't have $5. I think the fundamental problem is Q cards are too hard to get. That, you know, that basically you can load a Q card with a very low amount of money. The problem is that there aren't nearly enough places to get your card to start using it. And I think we can fix that.
I'm going to continue on the fares for a minute. In 2008 and 9, and even during this board's tenure, 2010, they used what I consider to be bogus projections on fare revenues going out to 2030. And during the referendum, the new board put out some new numbers for fare box revenues that did not show fare increases every 5 years, which I think there should be. And it showed in 2030 or 35 that fare revenue would be about $100 million. And that's without any fare increases. For strategic planning purposes, what revenues, fare box revenues, are you all going to use? Are you going to, you know, a long time ago, 2 years ago, they used out-of-date Barton Smith numbers. They were still using those numbers in 2009. Now you've got what I consider to be reasonable fare box numbers shown as of July 2012. Those are not the same numbers you showed the federal government in 2011.
Okay, I mean,
so
I think you're going down a rabbit hole. Fundamentally, there's this question of who got shown what number where is an entirely irrelevant question. We know what our financial standing is going forward. The projections we're showing use no fare increases as a baseline because we think that's a reasonable baseline for projections. It is not a policy of not having fare increases. It is simply saying we're going to build some assumptions into these projections to understand what the future looks like, and that's one of the assumptions we built in. Obviously, it does not make sense to permanently freeze fares. We'd have 5-cent fares today, and that probably wouldn't make sense. If you look at what the cost of our fares have done compared to inflation, we're an incredibly cheap system to ride. So fundamentally, that was sort of our going-in projection. What we're talking about with this process is not long-term stuff. This is next 5 years, not next 15 or 20. So obviously, the projections for the next 5 are going to be more solid than the projections for the next 20. So
you really don't think those 3 rail lines are going to be open in 2014, do you?
They're going to be open in 2014.
The full lines, all of Harrisburg, all of the
Not all of
Southeast?
Harrisburg.
Huh?
No, the underpass won't be complete.
The underpass, so all of Harrisburg won't. Well, it's my opinion that Metro is broke in 2014. You have no cash to operate.
Or not. But anyway, I think you've been kind of monopolizing the conversation. A couple other people have their hands up.
This may be a little bit off topic, but is there a way that we can get the city of Houston to spend general mobility funds on transit streets so that transit riders actually have a more comfortable ride and therefore are more willing to ride? Westheimer being a classic.
Yeah, I was just going to mention anybody who's ridden Westheimer recently. I am not the city, so I'm not the right person to answer that question. Clearly, general mobility funds can bring a lot of benefit to transit users if they're spent in the right places. But what the city wants to do, that's not my call.
Yeah. I have a couple of questions. One on following up on that with the CIP process in the city. All the civic organizations and super neighborhoods get involved in that. We've looked at where we want to see the extension of the Harrisburg line in the future. And we've noticed some places where plans might limit being able to do that. How can we get involved in prior planning to make sure that those areas stay open for eventual?
And some of those conversations are actually already going on. I mean, I think this idea of can we identify future transit corridors and then build roadways in such a way that they can accommodate those future transit corridors make a lot of sense. And that kind of coordination is actually going on between Metro and the city.
And the second question is on the meeting times. We talked about the bicycle meetings, which are going on next week. If you ride your bike on transit and you go downtown, you'll be able to attend those meetings. If you go to the medical center or someplace else, you're not going to be able to make those meeting times for those focus groups. So going forward, I just want to make sure that we can have times that people are actually using the system can get to. I know in the East End we've had a number of meetings that start like at 6 o'clock. People are just getting home on transit.
No, I think that's a good comment, and we've tried when we did some of the general mobility meetings, for example, to try to find some different times. So I think specifically on the bike and ride, I'm not the one scheduling those meetings, so I think that's a good comment, and I'll pass it on.
Christof, they're looking at doing a weekend one, I think, coming up for the bike and ride project. So I don't think those are the last two that are happening.
Okay, from the consultant. So, and then David, you had your hand up, and that may be the last question. David.
So, going back to the park and ride, I mean, I think it's incredibly important in service. And it's key to a lot of satisfaction out there in the region. But in I-10, Metro lost its HOV. Right? It's taken away from them by Metro now. Your buses there are at their pleasure.
Well, which is actually true for all of our HOV lanes, incidentally. But
well, no, but Harris County's not in charge of the rest of the major.
Right, but the state of Texas.
The state of Texas is, which is, I realize, just as difficult a problem. And so if what you're going to be, one of the things that will come up over and over again, of course, in the process is going to be, can we make those HOV lanes two-way? Because that's otherwise, it doesn't work. But will we be also looking at the reality that you're going to lose the space you have at 290? That's already been decided. You're never going to have it at 288. That's been decided. And I think it's been decided at 945 that you're going to lose that space.
Right.
And eventually all the space will go away. Well, I'll go back to textile. And you'll be there at their pleasure. How do you plan a system where you're losing your right-of-way?
Well,
to serve regionally, because the pressure is on to serve regionally.
Right.
Yet they're taking your space from you. So why is that so important to worry about?
Well, I mean, a couple of points. The first is we are not really good in this region at getting different agencies to work together. And I do think that is improving slightly, but for the most part, we're really bad at this coordination. TxDOT is not the State Highway Department. They are the State Transportation Department. And what I hope is that in these corridors going forward, we realize that the goal is to move people. It's not to move vehicles. It's not to move buses. It's to move people. And that if you design a highway properly, it can move those people in a variety of different modes that together will be a lot more effective than if you try doing one of them by itself. So I hope that as a state and as a region, we get much better with this kind of coordination. And we haven't been good in the past. I'm encouraged by signs that we are getting better at it. The second is ultimately what will preserve service like the park and ride? What will preserve it is political support. Well, if it's successful in terms of gaining riders, and those riders vote, which they do, then that is the thing that can most protect the service. Because the contract we have with TxDOT lets TxDOT throw us out of the freeway at any time they feel like it with some ridiculously short period of notice. So in the end, those lanes have never been contractually assured. There are some federal protections for federally funded highways, but fundamentally, if the lanes don't have a political constituency, they're going to go away, and if they have a political constituency, that service will remain, even if it looks very different. And something like I have no problem with HOT lanes. If they're operated properly, they can give buses every bit as good a service as a dedicated HOT. But that's a big if. And so the pieces that are needed here is the agencies have to actually work together. And I think in the past, Metro has been absent from a lot of these conversations. And that's what happened. A lot of what happened on 290 is the during the environmental process, I don't think Metro played a strong enough role. And that basically those conclusions that were reached a couple of years ago are tying our hands now. So we have to be aggressive in coordinating on all of these projects. And then fundamentally, we build ridership and we'll build some political support. That's what will keep us.
So just one quick response to that, which is that your agency's goal is to move people. I would argue that TxDOT's goal is to open land for development. They're not a transportation agency. They're a land development agency. And so is Hector. And so how would you ever get to a place where you can work together when your goals are so different? That's one. And then two, I would ask you to take Mike's question.
So I think the point to that is, even if that is your goal, and I agree, I mean, why do we expand 290? It's not really for the people who live there right now. We're really expanding it for the people who haven't moved there yet. On the other hand, the people who haven't moved there yet will also benefit from good park and ride service. So that, well, even if you think that is TxDOT's goal, then improving the transit service still serves the same goal. We actually know that suburban developers like having park and ride service. It's something they can market. It's something that will cause people to move to. Last question.
I'm a little bit anxious about how the process is going to work, this redesign process, because it's fundamentally the redesign concepts are technical, and the public input part of it, I'm just concerned that things will get, that things that make sense in a system sense will be vetoed by people that are concerned about their little, their individual routes and how it's going to change. Is that, can you alleviate my concern?
Somewhat. I can tell you I have exactly the same concern. And I think that a lot of the problem with transit is that transit agencies don't know how to talk about transit in the way that the public actually understands. And this is especially true since a large portion of the public never rides transit. So that concepts like frequency are difficult to understand if you don't personally experience them, because cars don't have frequency, buses. So a key part of this is figuring out how to communicate. I think that has been one of Metro's big shortcomings in the past. I remember going to public meetings for the East End Light Rail line where they didn't even have a map showing the whole system. You know, there's this sort of explaining to people why they should care about things is something transit agencies have not been very good at. It's something those transit consultants have not been very good at. And I think it's a big part of this process. This process will fail if we are not able to communicate intelligently with the public. And that's hard. It's not easy.
It's going to be very unpopular.
Well, I think if we communicate well, it won't be. Because once again, I think we can come up with a system here that will serve a lot of people better. But you have to explain why it serves them better. And that's about how you talk. It's about how you make graphics. Like, one of the big problems is if your map has every bus route shown in the same thickness, you aren't fundamentally understanding the system when you look at that map. And if you draw that kind of map, what you're encouraging people to want is a direct line from their house to wherever they're going. Even if that line represents a bus that runs twice a day, it looks like they have a direct connection. You start thinking the lines to show frequency, then you're actually telling a different kind of story. And you're encouraging people to look for connections rather than direct routes. So a lot of this is about how we communicate, and that's not something transit agencies can do that.
But Christof, I think he has somewhat of a good point, which is, I know as an engineer, it's easy to think, clean sheet, let's do this optimally, right?
Right.
But what I would say is think a little bit about, if I can get 90% as good as optimal or 80% as good as optimal, but diffuse 80% of the opposition by keeping some of the popular existing routes. You know, the optimal system is going to turn over a lot of routes, and that's just going to naturally generate a lot of political opposition. And that's something that's hard to think through, but you say, look, okay, I know this is a little non-optimal, but it will keep a lot of people from protesting at the meeting.
No, I think that is actually, that should be part of the process. And the other thing, and somebody made this point once, and I thought it was a good one, is that even if you completely redesign the system, in the end, your system is going to have a lot of things that are very similar. I still know, I guarantee you that Westheimer will have a frequent bus on. Absolutely guaranteed. And if Westheimer has a frequent bus on it, we don't have to say that that's a new route. We can call that the 81. You know, like basically you can actually redesign the system, but when you present it, not present it as a redesigned system, but rather present it as this is an evolution of the system you know already. So I think it's important for the process not to be mentally constrained by what we have today, not to be locked into assumptions that are based on history that may not be true anymore. But when you get to the end, you'll find there's a lot of things about the thing that are familiar. And you don't present it to riders as, hey, everything has changed. You actually point out that a lot of the things they're used to are the same and other things are better.
Just, I'd like to make a short addition to that. If we could have workshops before the public input sessions, people in the neighborhoods then can kind of get an idea of what we're aiming for instead of providing in that same meeting where they may not have been able to.
This is really intended to be an integral public process, which doesn't mean we come out with a final plan and we post it and then you say, come to a hearing and complain to us about it. It's really that we involve people all the way through the process. So that's exactly the intent. All of the above? I think it will take a lot of different tools.
Community website?
We haven't, what?
A website, a community website where people can post messages, feedback, discussions.
Absolutely all of those things. And we are looking at the consultant. If you actually pull up the RFQ on the Metro website, one of the things we've actually asked the consultants to do is tell us how you think we should do public outreach on this. So the reason I'm not telling you the answers is because we haven't actually figured this out yet. We're early in the process. But we are going to do everything we can to get as many people as possible involved. Because otherwise this is going to fail. If we don't run the public involvement process well, we're going to get to the end of the day and we're going to have so much of an uproar that the board will vote to cancel the whole thing and just continue with the system we have, which would be a gigantic shame. So the whole goal here is to run the process so that we have support for the final community, because it's a good one. I think Jay's trying to...
A couple final notes here. One little note, the goal of Metro or TxDOT is not to move people, it's to give people greater access to things.
Agreed.
None of us are interested in moving a bunch. We're interested in getting to the place we're trying to get, or the place we're wanting to get to actually be right there. But that's a really important distinction. I just want to say again, if you believe in this kind of forum, Houston Tomorrow can't exist without your help. And then there's another event tonight. We're a partner on the Houston Green Film Series. It's every month at Rice University Media Center. Tonight is The Last Mountain, and it's about Appalachia and coal. And so if you want to come to that, it's a $5 suggestion donation at the Rice University Media Center, which is 2030 University, or entrance 8 at Rice.
You get fed.
And you get fed for your $5. The food is at 6:30, movie at 7, and there's a panel after the movie. And then final thought. Oh, well, I guess thank you so much, Christof.
Yeah.
I guess we're not having one of these next month. It would be Christmas Day or so.